Hi there. Welcome back to Energetically You. I'm your host, Megan Swan, a mindset and wellness coach specializing in all things natural energy, abundant mindset, and healthy habits. I have the honor today of speaking with Lodro Rinzler. He is a meditation teacher and the author of 7 books, and he is the co-founder of Mindful Meditation Studios in New York City. That's MNDFL Meditation Studios. His books, Walk Like a Buddha and The Buddha Walks Into the Office, both have received Independent Publishers Book Awards. It's a true honor to have him on the show today. Lodro has taught meditation for 19 years in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and travels frequently for his books, has spoken across the world at conferences, universities, and businesses, and he is named one of the 50 inventors shaping the future of wellness by SONIMA. Rinzler's work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Good Morning America, CBS, and NBC. So let's dive in. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Energetically You. I have the honor today of speaking with Lodro Rinzler. He is a meditation expert with 20 plus years of experience and 2 awarded books. I am so thrilled to have him here today and so curious to get to know him better. Thank you, Lodro, for agreeing to be on the show. How are you today?
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's, we were speaking right before we hit record that it is a little bit hot. We're in the midst of a heat wave at the moment, but I'm quite cheerful regardless.
Perfect. Where are you?
So I'm based in upstate New York. I spent the majority of my life in New York City. And my wife and I moved up here 2 years ago. And we just sort of had very fortunate timing in that we left New York City right before the pandemic. And moved into a home with a yard and things like that, not knowing, of course, that there was all of this happening and how long it would be before we could all have time and freedom to move about. So we've been very fortunate in the grand scheme of things to be here and to care for a very old house that's falling apart and have it's the old meme of, just wanting to have the yard that our dog deserves, that it has a yard. So it's things like that are the simple pleasures in life.
Yeah, well, I think most people took this year plus now, coming on 2 years, to reflect on those things that are important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, not to immediately pivot into the latest book, but, I wrote about this in my new book, Take Back Your Mind, which is a book on anxiety. And this aspect, there's a chapter in there just on the power of simplicity. Like looking at what all of the things that we take on, and sometimes no one's asking us to take on more and more and more except for us, but then we start to stress ourselves out about it, anxiety ensues, and lo and behold, our mind is taken over by it. So it's a situation where in my own personal experience, it's simplifying. And part of that meant just sort of simplifying my livelihood, my living situation, the whole 9 yards, to the extent that I was there's just less triggers for anxiety than there used to be in the midst of what has been a deeply uncertain and anxious time for so many of us.
Yes. I was just talking about our ability now to just rest without needing to make it more efficient, our resting, just be and just do literally nothing is increasingly difficult I'll speak for myself. And I think, meditation is a huge gateway into finding that nothingness. Can you speak on that?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting term because I think a lot of people would hope that they sit down to meditate once and then their mind turns off and there's nothing playing in the background. Then they're just in complete bliss mode or something like that. And yet I think part of, the years I've been teaching meditation, it's been this part of like, yes, I know you've seen that on TV, you've seen that in magazines, but you'll find that the reality is often that thoughts do arise, and that, the mind does have lots of opportunities to wander off. So it's not like there's nothing playing in the background. It's sort of like the thoughts just become less alluring to us, and we're more able to rest and be in the present moment. Of course, there's a million types of meditation out there. And I grew up in a Buddhist household. I started practicing meditation in that tradition, 20 some odd years, 30 some odd years ago. But these days we often refer to one form of meditation in the Buddhist tradition as mindfulness. There's many different ways that people talk about it. In the Zen traditions, they call it Zazen. In Tibetan traditions, they might call it Shamatha. But, the idea here is being mindful of the body breathing as a way to not just hold our attention to something very simple, something fresh, something that is just based in our own ability to be present. Our basic essence of being alive is feeling the breath. So we have an opportunity here to really work with the mind. And when thoughts do arise, and they do come up during meditation, as they do in our post-meditation hours, that we can acknowledge them, come back to the breath. And every time we do that, we're sort of like flexing a bit of a mental muscle here, where we're getting a little bit better at saying, oh, look, there's this alluring story that's coming up about this thing I want to have happen, this thing I want to avoid, whatever. And I don't have to chase after that right now. I can actually come back to the body breathing again. I can feel the body just being present to the breath. And then the mind wanders off again. We acknowledge it, we come back. But what we're doing there, when I sort of made the gesture of like mentally training ourselves, we're noticing that we can retrain the mind to not go down every anxiety-producing rabbit hole that might arise, and instead learn to live in the present moment. When we are actually in the present moment, we do find a sense of contentment, a sense of peace, a sense of calm. It's always been there. It's not like all of a sudden, we went out to Walmart and bought a bunch of peace, brought it back. Now we have it. It's like it's already inside us. And we're just sort of letting go of the attachment to all of the thoughts that arise, all of the stories that come up, to the extent that we can just discover it and develop more of a relationship to it.
Yeah, definitely. No, I didn't mean that it's like an ultimate goal of thinking of nothing, because I completely agree that isn't possible or should be a goal. But yeah, I feel like the superpower is managing our attention, right? And I recently had the honor of going on a mini vacation and spending time with my kids in nature. And, just every day we would spend a little bit of time under this same tree and see how many little lizards happen to be moving up and down, and how many bees and how many butterflies. And that is so important, I think, but increasingly difficult for people to really just be in that present moment. Is there some exercise that you teach beyond breath that's mindfulness versus meditation to help people just be more in their present?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually sort of an interesting thing to distinguish between meditation and mindfulness. And frankly, I'm pretty convinced I'm going to confuse people by making the distinction, but it's worth making. Mindfulness is a form of meditation, but it also exists as a skill set that we can cultivate. That I, have my morning coffee here, I can pick it up and I can be completely mindful, present. Let's define mindfulness. We're being present to what is currently occurring without judgment. Okay, here we go. Boom. That was mindfulness at work, so to speak. I was present to sipping the coffee. I wasn't judging it, saying, oh, I wish it was hot. Now it's cold. I was just there for it. And that's an act of mindfulness. It would be awesome if we could be mindful all the time. And I think that's what people want. People want to just have some sort of hack or fix that they can just drop into the present moment. But like every other skill set that we develop, whether it's speaking a new language, learning a musical instrument, the more we practice it, the more fluent it becomes. So same thing here. This is why mindfulness meditation helps us become more mindful in the rest of our life. We call it meditation practice. Meditation practice implies we're practicing for something. In this case, we're practicing for all of the nitty-gritty aspects of our day. So if I'm actually learning to be mindful with something as simple as the breath, that means I am more able to be mindful of the coffee. I am more able to be mindful when I'm in a conversation with someone. And as you said, just place my attention there, not be splitting it 2-3 other directions. So it sort of starts to infiltrate our life in a really powerful way, the more we train in it in formal mindfulness meditation. Now, the confusing part is this is one of a million forms of meditation, right? Being mindful of the breath is great. There's also within the Buddhist tradition practices like loving kindness, where it's a heart-opening practice. Tonglen, which is sending and receiving. So there's a bit of a visualization and aspiration of relieving the suffering of others while we work with the breath. So there's many more techniques that we could do with the intent either of waking up our own mind, heart, or being more present, or both. And then there's, of course, other traditions that have meditation. So while mindfulness is really prevalent here in the West these days, coming from the Buddhist tradition, there's also Vedic meditation and transcendental meditation, where we work with a mantra, bringing about deep relaxation in the body. There's Kundalini meditation, which rouses energy in the body. So there's many forms. And I often think about it, to go back to a previous example, as that sense of like learning an instrument. When I was a kid, I was handed a violin, and someone said, why don't you try this? And I did, and I didn't like it at a certain point. I put it down and never picked up an instrument again. But I do wonder sometimes if someone had said, try the violin. Now over here, we've got a guitar. Try the guitar. Now over here, try the piano. Maybe I would have fallen in love with the piano and still been playing it today. So I'm always, it's like when people study meditation with me, I'm always like, yeah, try out this technique. See if it resonates with you. The first few times you do it, it might feel as clumsy as picking up a new musical instrument and not knowing where your fingers are supposed to go and so on. But you do it a little bit and you get used to it and you say, yeah, maybe this is for me, or maybe this isn't, in which case you can try another musical instrument until you find one that feels really resonant with you. So, I'm biased towards Buddhist practices because that's what I've spent my life doing. But I also realize that there are many forms of meditation out there. For people who want to try to live a more mindful life, I do think the mindfulness meditation practice is a good way to go.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you a similar question. So, could you compare it to, you have 20 plus years of experience with different kinds of meditation, and, it's very bio-individual. And is it also phasal? Like when I'm helping people improve their diet so it helps them feel more energetic, it really is very dependent on many things about the person, the individual, but then also like what phase of their life they're in or what phase of the year. And is it something that can sort of ebb and flow, or is it more like you need to work to find the one or two that really work for you and build on that?
It's a good question. I'll continue with this analogy that I seem to be now stuck in of the musical instrument. So at some point, I do need to settle in and say, if I'm going to learn the violin, I'm going to learn the violin and not just keep kicking around. At some point, I need to settle in and just learn the instrument. But having learned the violin, I now have a skill set in terms of like cello, other stringed instruments that will be pretty relevant and easily translatable, let's say. So I often recommend people start with a practice like mindfulness, and then as they continue to evolve, I don't necessarily know if it's the phases of one's life or just the development of one's mind. Because I have people who started when they were 17, people who started when they were 77 that work with me, and they, working with our mind is working with our mind. Often the people who are a little bit older often think, God, I wish I had the opportunity to begin this earlier. Could have saved me a lot of trouble and heartbreak and mistakes along the way if I had been able to work with my mind in the way I am now back when. And so I don't know if it's like necessarily related to one's part of the life that they're in, but I do think that once you've sort of developed a base, let's say, of understanding of a practice, then all of a sudden you start to say, oh, there are other practices that might feel a little bit more relevant to what I'm currently going through that I can add into the mix. And that could be a situation, again, not based of life, but just based on what's going on with people. Oh, I'm having a lot of trouble with difficult people. Maybe loving kindness is a good practice for me to focus on. So it's more of like what's coming up in life as opposed to one's age, for example.
Yeah. And how do you help people with this idea? Like we're always wanting to see the improvement, feel like we're getting better. Practice implies that we're getting better at it. So I recently heard Jay Shetty on one of his podcasts saying, like, I wish it hadn't taken me 9 of the 18 years I've been meditating to stop like seeking my quote unquote best meditation session that I had, and just be open to it not needing to be like any other session I've ever had. Do you help people sort of release this need to feel a constant improvement in some sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's an old adage that any meditation is good meditation. And we can't, I mean, if we go back to that definition of mindfulness from before, the idea of being present to what's currently occurring without judgment, those last 2 words are really important. To be without judgment of ourselves, of our experience, of our practice is essential to the act of mindfulness. So we might at times sit down and say, my mind's all over the place, I must be a bad meditator. And then we're just using this as a tool to beat ourselves up, which actually helps no one. It's not how we whip the mind into shape. Like, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So to be without judgment and say, this practice is just a practice session. I might have more thoughts or less thoughts than yesterday or last week. That's fine. I'm learning to be without judgment of myself. That is such a valuable skill set, because we often think, oh, I'm just training the mind to be more present, to be focused, as we talked about before. But within that, there's also an act of kindness. We're training the mind to be kinder to ourselves. And the kinder we are to ourselves, the kinder we will be to others. So there's an element here of every time we drift off in meditation, we acknowledge, oh, I drifted off. Do we then start to beat ourselves up? Oh, I'm bad at this. Or do we say to ourselves, it's okay. It's not a big deal. This happens to literally everyone. We come back very gently to the breath itself, offering ourselves that moment of kindness. So in that way, we train not just in being present, but also in kindness itself.
Yeah, I love that. So can you tell us the evolution? So you're writing, or you've written your 3rd book?
So Take Back Your Mind is the 7th book. It came out in February. So it's been a few months at this point. It still feels like a brand new book. The last book I wrote came out about 5 years ago, which is crazy. I fell into a rabbit hole starting a network of meditation studios and took years off of writing as a result. But for a while, starting in 2012, I was churning out about a book a year. So the first one was The Buddha Walks into a Bar, which came out in 2012. And then that led to Walk Like a Buddha, The Buddha Walks into the Office, Sit Like a Buddha. You can understand the themes here. But all these books seem to really revolve around different aspects of bringing meditation into our daily life. Not just meditation for academic sake, or, here's how to meditate, although I guess I could argue Sit Like a Buddha is maybe the closest to that. But really, how do we integrate this act into our daily life so that we live more mindful and compassionate lives overall? And the most recent one, Take Back Your Mind, is really it was partly written during this pandemic, and it's coming from that perspective of how many of us are struggling with uncertainty. We're struggling with anxiety, and we do not know how to work with the mind in the midst of that. And as you asked about earlier, yes, there's meditation, but there's also just simple on-the-spot techniques that allow us to drop out of the stories that keep us locked in pain and into the present moment. So it's not just, oh, I meditate and then I'm done for the day. But there is a heavier emphasis in this most recent book on how do we parse out the day in different ways so that when we notice we are being taken over by anxiety and all of the stories that relate to that anxiety, can we actually just cut through and come back into this very moment on the spot?
Yeah, very, very timely. So can you share with us, did you notice anything that was coming up for people that kind of surprised you as a reaction to what we've all experienced the last year and a half?
Yeah, I would say, it's interesting because even long-term meditators would, in the early weeks of the pandemic, turn to me and say, so when do you think this is going to be over? And it's such an interesting, because obviously I do not know, I'm not a scientist. It was very sweet that they would think I would know something more than them. And I would answer it that way. I'd say, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows at this point. And wouldn't it be interesting then to take this as an opportunity to get used to not knowing? Getting used to hanging out in uncertainty. Because pandemic aside, uncertainty isn't going to like go away for the rest of our life. We're going to be doing something and then all of a sudden our job is in question, or whether our promotion is in question, whatever. Like all of a sudden there's uncertainty again. We're dating someone and then where is this going? And we feel uncertain about it. Like there's all sorts of versions of uncertainty that play out in the course of one's life. So could we start to actually just, similar with the book on, this book on anxiety, like can we drop beneath the symptoms and the stories of today and deal with the disease itself of anxiety and uncertainty? Can we start to uproot some of the habitual ways that we relate to that and do something new, which is actually based in treating ourselves a little bit better and letting ourselves a little bit more off the hook?
Yeah. I think I had some chills with that because I feel like that's so key. I mean, there's always, I think for most people, the pandemic was just an awakening to the reality that there is so much more unknown than they were willing to face before. That always was there. It was like a smack in the face of on many levels in many aspects of their lives. So what's the best way for people to get a hold of the book?
Yeah, I mean, that's the nice thing these days. I know that not everyone can even get into their local bookstore at this point, but there's websites that are devoted to indie booksellers like bookshop.org. If people want to order it on Amazon, that's always a way. I saw it was even listed at Walmart for some reason, which is unknown to me. So sometimes these things end up, I don't even know where, but generally, where books are sold, or if you want to request it from your local bookstore, I'm sure they could also carry it. But Bookshop is great. Amazon, of course, is Amazon. And, I think generally wherever people would like to buy books, they can probably find it. So the full title is Take Back Your Mind, Buddhist Advice for Anxious Times, which is really what we're living in. I do feel like even compared to 20, 30 years ago, the speed of our world has increased. And it used to be that you would come home from a day of work, and unless someone had the audacity to call you on your landline after 5 o'clock, you would leave work at work, for many of us. Mm-hmm. And these days, it's sort of like you could be at home and an email message appears on this phone that's sitting right next to you saying, hey, can you send me this thing very quickly? And it's 10 o'clock at night and you just are like, fine, I'll do it. It's sort of, it's a different time. We have more room for distraction. We have more room to be provoked and to have stressful situations enter our life. So we sort of have to get a little bit more creative and a little bit gutsier around how we address them.
Yeah. Well, quickly, can you leave us with your own personal strategy maybe on I like to call them digital buffers. Like, what do you do in your own life to keep those distractions at bay?
Yeah, going back to that third chapter on the power of simplicity, a lot of the stuff that I had to learn was setting up boundaries around, as you said, digital stuff in particular, but that also means I read the news in the morning and that's where I get my news. And it sort of stays there, and that's okay. I'm not constantly on Twitter and looking for the breaking news. The news will reach me when it reaches me, which, used to be you would read the newspaper in the morning. So sort of returning to some form of that mentality for me has been helpful. Not answering email after a certain hour, often around 7. Certain things like that where it's like, oh, and now I'm done with this thing being work, news, social media. And now I get to move into this thing, dinner with my wife, time with friends, whatever. And I'm not actually multitasking. So it's that applied or infiltrated mindfulness that we're just present with what's currently happening. And then when that's done, we'll move into the next thing. So I think those boundaries can actually be really helpful for us. And just by way of like on the spot, because I do realize that people are like, okay, I should meditate. But what do I do about my anxiety? There's so many stories. From the book, there's a lot of different on the spot techniques, as I mentioned, but one that I'll offer here for anyone who's thinking that at this time would very much just be noticing when we're spinning out the 50th version of the story. Well, what if they say this? I'll say that. Then they'll say this, I'll say that. At a certain point, we can just interrupt that flow with a simple question. Either, is this useful or is this helpful? Both of them are very good. When we ask that question of ourselves, we might very quickly get the answer, no, this isn't helpful. This person's not even here. And I don't know about anyone else, but I've actually never been able to accurately predict every nuance of a conversation. It's 0% success rate. If I spent minutes or hours playing out that conversation, it's never gone that way. So I know at this point, no, this is not helpful. This is not useful. And somehow just sort of asking that simple question, you say, oh, if it's not helpful, it's not useful, then I should direct my mental energy elsewhere. Maybe I can come back into the body and the breathing. Maybe I can come back to washing the dishes or whatever we're doing in that moment.
Oh my God, that phrase infiltrated mindfulness is everything. I want to leave it off there. It's brilliant. Thank you so much. We will share all of the links in the show notes, but where the time you do share your life on social media, where's the best place to connect with you?
Sure. The nice thing about having a name like Lodro Rinzler is that you own all the domain names, so lodrorinzler.com. And I always mention, actually, when people reach out to me through there, it's not like there's some team in the background that's like navigating my emails. I respond personally to anyone who wants to actually connect, so that people can always reach out to me through lodrorinzler.com. And then, of course, Instagram and Facebook and Twitter are all Lodro Rinzler.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to sharing this interview.
Thank you so much for having me on and for the conversation.